Back again, are we? You must have a taste for the terrifying. Tonight, we'll explore a story so chilling, it'll make you second-guess every shadow that creeps in your home. After returning from a night to celebrate the arrival of the new year, my husband and I returned to our apartment complex to turn in for the night. We both had a couple of drinks, but neither of us were intoxicated. As much as we enjoy partying with friends, when it comes down to it, we are really just homebodies. We lived in the corner penthouse suite of our complex. Although this was never confirmed, it was suspected the owners wanted to convert this apartment complex into condos. The rent certainly was not cheap, and access was limited to this floor. Upon entering the building, there is a walk-up to secure doors, and every now and then there would be a doorman to greet you as you entered or exited. There were also multiple security cameras placed throughout and around the building. It was an especially cold evening, and when we returned, there was no doorman present. It was late, at least 2:30 a.m. The foyer was empty, and one of the lights flickered softly. My husband and I entered the elevator and pressed the button to the top floor. The elevator ride was smooth, and as we ascended, I could feel myself becoming more relaxed, excited to finally be home and able to rest. My feet were killing me from wearing heels all night in the bitter cold. The bell chimed, signaling we had reached our floor. The door slid open, and we turned the corner to the left. Like I said, our suite was the corner suite at the end of the hall. However, something caught our eye. A woman, or what at least looked like a woman, was meandering through the hallway. Her hair was dark and scattered, it looked to be matted and covered her face. She wore a black lace dress that was torn and looked to be in bad shape. Thinking back, I don't even think she had any footwear on. We assumed she was intoxicated and was having difficulty finding her suite. Although on closer inspection, she didn't look familiar. We knew all of our neighbors, as, like I said, access was limited on this floor. I looked at my husband, who stood still as well. I could see he was contemplating the same thoughts. I asked him, should we ask if she needs help? He looked at me and said, just wait, maybe she's just drunk and having a hard time finding her suite. The woman just continued to slowly slide herself along the walls of the hallway, stopping at each door and peering through the exterior peepholes. Admittedly, this was creepy, but it just added to the theory that she was a drunk woman looking for her friends. She was humming, or what I believe was humming. The sound was something between a growl and a hum. We stood there in utter disbelief and awe. However, there was a veil of tension and uneasiness that lingered. The strange woman stumbled through the hallway, hunched over, until she pulled herself up to peer through the peephole. She eventually got to a suite of an elderly lady, whom I have a strong connection with. We'll just call her Evelyn. Evelyn was the sort of woman whose family had neglected her and rarely visited. She would bring my husband and me baked goods from time to time. I would bring her leftovers and assist her with groceries and medication. Frequently, Evelyn's smoke alarm would constantly go off. I would have to rush over and pull out the smoldering toast from her toaster and fan her smoke alarm until it stopped beeping. At times, a nuisance, but it would always turn into tea time. Nevertheless, I cared about Evelyn. So when I saw this strange woman peer into her peephole, I reacted. I blurted out, "Excuse me, are you all right?" I could feel myself lose confidence as I asked. The strange woman seemed to shudder for a moment and hunched over to the floor. She looked like she was about to puke or was frightened by my voice. My husband and I stepped closer, but the woman then let out a series of soft and menacing laughs, just barely audible. I have to admit, in this moment I was thoroughly creeped out and reached for my cell phone. It was uncomfortable because we couldn't get to our suite. Without having to walk right past this deranged woman, my husband said, "Hey, did you hear us? Do you need help?" Her laugh began to grow into what was a steady cackle. The strange woman then stood up. As she stood up, her cackle became a mixture between a cackle and a boisterous growl. She then stumbled forward and continued walking down the hall. There was a staircase just outside of our suite. I assumed she was making her way to the stairs, just too embarrassed to walk past us to the elevator. Maybe she was just a drunk woman, and this was nothing more than an uncomfortable standoff with a sad and intoxicated woman. I mean, if she was really that drunk, the stairs probably weren't a good idea. We were on the 7th floor. Nevertheless, I just didn't feel like it was worth the risk to engage with this woman. I just wanted to enter my suite and dive into bed. It was late, and my feet still hurt. As we took a few steps forward, the woman stopped, almost with laser precision. She stood up completely straight, looked right at our door, and then began to pound on our door, screaming bloody murder. I could feel myself becoming swallowed with fear. I reached for my cell phone and began to dial 911. The woman kept pounding on our door and screaming. To be honest, I'm surprised none of our neighbors came out to see what was happening. Part of me thinks they were too afraid themselves and were probably peering out of their peepholes. Afraid of what our neighbors would think, my husband said, "Hey, what are you doing? Stop that." And just like that, the strange woman stopped, fell to the ground, and began crawling quickly towards us. She looked up for a brief second. All I could see were her dark eyes. Her mouth seemed to be stained black, and she was growling again, but this time it was as if there was something in her throat that she was choking on. Frozen with fear, my husband and I just watched until she flashed us a menacing hiss, the kind you would hear in a movie but never imagined in real life. Terrified, I whipped off my shoes, and my husband and I ran towards the staircase on the other side of the building. We didn't want to risk waiting for the elevator and have her catching up. We went down 2 flights of stairs and stopped to listen if she was making her way down the stairs, but it was almost impossible to hear as my heart was pounding so hard. I thought to myself, what the hell was going on? We waited there for 10 minutes or so until eventually, we had the courage to head up the stairs and back to our suite. The woman was gone, and so we entered our suite. I was just relieved to finally be safe in my home. My husband sent a text to our landlord, and he replied that we would hear from him in the morning. I was so unbelievably exhausted but found it incredibly difficult to sleep. The sound of that woman's growling and cackling rang in my ears. I hardly slept. The next day, when my husband went to speak to the landlord, he asked him to check the security cameras. Although nothing turned up, the landlord said the cameras glitched due to the frigid temperatures last night. To this day, I still don't know what to think. That woman most certainly had problems. The question is, was she dangerous? We moved about a year later, but every New Year's Eve, I still think about that night. It was New Year's Eve of 2020, and all of us were ready for this horrible year to be over. My friend Michael was throwing a house party. I arrived early to help set things up. I secured a spot to sleep in his parents' room, meaning I could drive to the party and drink without having to worry about driving home. His parents obviously weren't home for the night. Most of our close friends in our friend group came, plus a bunch of Michael's friends who I didn't know. The party was fun. At midnight, everyone screamed Happy New Year and cheered their drinks. After that, people slowly started circulating out, and the party started to quiet down as people went to either other parties, bars, or home. The later the night got, the more it became just the closer friends staying behind, until it just turned into a chill drinking session in the living room. This went on late into the night. It was likely 2:40 a.m. when the last of everyone who wasn't sleeping at Michael's house was gone. As it quieted down, we started hearing this occasional sound. At first, we didn't know what it was, but it soon started to sound like a creaking sound. It was dismissed as a sound from the fridge or something at first, which I know sounds stupid, but house appliances often make weird noises. It was just Michael, me, and Lloyd. Lloyd was falling asleep on the couch already. It was reaching that time where we were just going to go to sleep. However, eventually, we got so bothered by the noise that we had to search. We went to the kitchen, and it wasn't coming from in there. We realized when we were close to the basement door that it was coming from downstairs. Michael opened the door, and we heard this creaking sound. "Go check what it is," I said. He kept saying, "No way." Then he called down into the basement, "Yo, who's down there?" The creaking stopped, and we never heard it again. After a solid minute of waiting at the top of the stairs, we agreed to go down together. We both grabbed knives, drunkenly thinking that was a good idea, when in reality, we were so drunk we'd probably only hurt ourselves with them. We got to the bottom of the stairs and looked through the entire basement. It's not huge, it just has a couch, TV, a bar, a table in a corner, and various old pieces of junk. It was pretty messy at the time. The first thing we did was search any possible crevice for someone who could be hiding. Then we tried to figure out what could have been making that sound. I noticed a rocking chair, and so I went up to it, sat in it, and then started rocking in it. It made the exact same creaking sound we had been hearing. Michael and I looked at each other. I stood up, and so did every hair on my body. I don't think we ever ran faster than we did when we ran up those stairs and slammed the door shut. We tried to come up with any logical explanation, but there was none. He kept the basement door locked for days until his parents came back. There was no living soul down there, but something was moving that rocking chair. That rocking chair used to belong to his grandma, who passed away forever ago, and it's just something his mom held on to for sentimental reasons. I can't say I've ever experienced anything resembling the paranormal before this, nor since then. It still sends chills down my spine. When I was 12, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there, they divorced. My mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was habitually leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. I knew most of the people, if not by name then by face, enough to wave and have a small chat with. I had never been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on the USA channel, and I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 12, I wasn't concerned with the electricity bills or even saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party or people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off of the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen and leads directly into the living room where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off of the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started, as slowly and as quietly as I could, to make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide and seek in the dark many, many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything, it was just like they were moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the doorway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and I ran down the hallway. I believe the only reason I wasn't grabbed by now is because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children would do when they're afraid. I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and I ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time as it was right off the side of the couch. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked and the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it certainly wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. That after he had stopped, though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure. I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side. It was also several feet off the ground as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what had happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why. Scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there, I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out this kind of window was a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated person. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house. That's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked back up the steps and started peering inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, meaning no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe at how stupid this could have turned out, and I wish I would have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, and anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterward. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and I noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, and checked all the windows and front door. Then I called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker, who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on. This past New Year's was my and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year, we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle, and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage, and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snow plowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire, playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped, and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snow plowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb host and ask if they or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back. This time, we actually drove up the driveway towards the top of the hill. Part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw the footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up, and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in a hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie with champagne. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 2 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on, and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. Once again, we sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute mind when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. Then, soon, we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were two policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer who did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked, and again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, locking all the doors again, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving. While we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 2 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater all that time. It was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. Very few people experience something so traumatizing at a young age that it sticks with them forever. I'm one of those people. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old. My older brother and I grew up in a broken household. Our mom raised us. Our dad was a deadbeat and disappeared out of our lives. Our mom worked 2 jobs to provide for us. She'd sometimes have to work night shifts and would usually have our grandma stay at the house on nights that she had to work. My brother Chump is 2 years older than me. We were fortunate enough to have our own bedrooms given the circumstances. We lived in a small house, but for the 3 of us and on our mom's dime alone, it wasn't terrible. The area in which we lived wasn't amazing, though. It was a night like any other. I can't remember if it was a school night or if it was a weekend. I don't remember any tiny details like that, but what I do remember is I was in the living room with my grandma. My grandma was watching TV, and I was playing with Legos on my Lego table. I was being loud and making a mess with them because I remember my grandma kept saying, "Rock, quiet down." Chump was already in bed. My bedtime was 9:30, given that it was probably approaching that time. I'm guessing this was a weekend night, otherwise, my bedtime would have been earlier. The layout of the house was simple: living room, dining room, and kitchen are all connected, and then there was a hallway which led to the bathroom and 3 bedrooms. Our mom's bedroom was at the end of the hall, mine was in the middle. Our grandma would sleep in our mom's bed when she'd stay over to watch us. Eventually, I had to go to sleep. My grandma would always go to sleep early too, so right after saying good night to me, she would go to the bathroom to brush her teeth and stuff before going to sleep as well. I was never one to be afraid of the dark or anything. My mom says I used to be a really brave child. But that night, I woke up in the middle of the night, something unusual for me because I remember myself being a very heavy sleeper. I heard something outside in the hallway, creaks in the floor. The wood floors in that house were always very creaky. Anytime someone walked down the hall, you'd hear it. I thought my grandma was going to the bathroom. However, the creaking didn't stop. It sounded like the creaks were moving back and forth. I got out of bed and went to the door to listen. Now, I heard whispering. I was more confused than anything. I thought my grandma was talking to Chump. I opened the door and looked into the hallway, and what I saw still haunts me. There was a tall, naked, skinny woman leaning on the wall with her head between her arms. She was whispering stuff to herself, and then, like a deer in headlights, her head whipped around to look at me. I screamed for my grandma like a little girl and slammed my door shut. There were pounds on my door, and the woman on the other side was screaming a name, "Bonnie, Bonnie, open the door." I kept screaming as loud as I could for my grandma, and I heard her scream in the hallway. I distinctly remember my grandma screaming, "Get the out of here." The woman screamed, "Where is Bonnie?" My grandma was in her mid-60s at the time, and she was still pretty quick. She yelled at me to keep my door locked, and she managed to fend off this crazy woman as she also called the police at the same time. I don't know how she did it, but my grandma was one tough woman. The woman left the house screaming, "Bonnie," and after locking the door, my grandma came to hug both me and Chump, who was awake and also crying from the commotion. We all sat huddled together until the police came. By that time, my grandma told us to just go back to sleep. This simply was a matter of my grandma not locking one of the doors, mixed with living in an already shady area. That woman had to be on crack or something. Seeing what I saw at such a young age did a number on me. I couldn't sleep alone for a long time. It was this incident that really resulted in us moving out of that house not long after. This story happened to me 4 years ago when I was in my mid-22s. This whole experience will probably scar me for life, and it's still vividly imprinted in my mind. The day was the 17th of June, and I had the house to myself because my parents were on a 2-week vacation in France. It was sometime after dusk, probably around 9 p.m., and the weather was scorchingly hot. Believe me when I say I was sweating my ass off with just my tank top and shorts on. The heat was so unbearable that I allowed in some fresh air, opening all the living room and bedroom windows, planning on closing them right before hitting the hay. Now, before fast-forwarding, I must mention that I was feeling extremely exhausted. On that same day, I had taken 3 exams in the morning and played a volleyball match in the afternoon. Thus, once I ate my dinner while browsing social media in my room, I collapsed into bed without even realizing it. I woke up at around 3 a.m. to the muffled sounds of thunderbolts and a draft of cold, fresh air hitting my face. A strong wind was blowing, and all the shutters left open were noisily banging. Still drowsy, I flicked on the lamp, but the light wouldn't turn on. I checked the plug using my phone flashlight, but everything was fine. I begrudgingly climbed out of bed and looked out my bedroom window. There were menacing rainy black clouds on the horizon. A typical late-night summer storm was approaching. Given that every lamp post on the street was off, I instantly knew there had been a blackout. Phone flashlight in hand, I dizzily headed down the hallway to shut the windows before rain started pouring down. When I got to the last window, though, I noticed the mosquito net lifted up. This struck me as weird since I was quite positive I hadn't left it that way. Getting a little paranoid, I turned behind me to shine the flashlight around the living room and check my surroundings. The furniture was still in place, no drawers or closet doors left open, no decorative objects missing or moved into unfamiliar positions. Everything seemed normal. I briefly peeked my head out of my window to look outside. Trees were swaying in the howling wind, leaves shaking in a frenzy, a powerful display of nature's force, but still nothing remotely suspicious. Maybe the mechanism is faulty, or the strong wind somehow pushed it up. Against my better judgment, I convinced myself it was useless to lose sleep over it. Feeling relieved, I closed the shutters and started walking back to my bedroom, eager to get a decent night's rest. Little did I know that night would be anything but pleasant. I happened to casually turn my head to the flight of stairs connected to the attic when a vivid burst of light flashing from up there caught my eyes. I paid no mind. The attic was adorned with huge glass windows, so it was no wonder to see light spreading across the room. It was probably sheet lightning. I kept walking, subconsciously waiting for the thunder to come, but it never did. I stopped in my tracks. Given that the flash I saw was powerful and bright, the lightning had to be pretty close, so why couldn't any rumbling noise be heard? I started to think maybe it wasn't lightning. What if it was a flashlight? As doubt crept in, my heart began to race. I quickly put 2 and 2 together, and now the strange occurrence of the mosquito net left up made much more sense. The nightmarish realization hit me that an intruder could have broken into my house. At first, I panicked. Did they hear me shutting the windows? Were they carrying any weapons? Did they plan on just robbing my house, or did they also have worse intentions? Normally, I would call my parents to deal with it, but since they were away, it was all on me now. While those sickening thoughts were swirling in my mind, the distinct sound of a doorknob being twisted and turned made me instantly snap out of my catatonic state. I shot my head to face the living room entrance, and through the glass frame, I spotted a shadowy figure just a few inches outside of the front door. There was a person standing there, most likely an accomplice of the guy upstairs. Words are not enough to describe how powerless and defenseless I felt. Despite the overwhelming fear, I did my best to keep my cool, trying to make as little noise as possible. I tiptoed in the direction of the stairs leading down to the basement, which was directly connected to the garage. I figured I could safely escape from there. While I was making my descent down, still using my phone as a source of light, I dialed 911. Speaking as softly as possible, I informed the operator about what just happened. He tried to calm me down and reassured me that the police would be there in less than 10 minutes. He also added that I should lock myself in a safe room and wait for the officers to show up. I was about to reply that I could easily sneak outside through the garage door when, all of a sudden, I lost the call. I immediately checked the phone and realized that down there, I had no signal. As if that wasn't enough, I also noticed the battery was almost dead. Once I reached the basement, I nervously assessed what to do. I could try and find an emergency flashlight, but now I was so close to escaping from the house that I didn't want to waste time rummaging through the drawers. Besides, I was mindful that the intruders upstairs could have heard me. In the heat of the moment, I exited the basement as fast as I could. Nonetheless, while making my way towards the garage door, I got a feeling in my gut telling me I was being watched. I don't even know why, maybe my sixth sense had picked up on something, but I pointed my phone to illuminate the back seats of my car. And there he was, a man's face stuck to the rear-view mirror. A disgusting, revolting face with dead, bulging wide eyes and a malicious yellowish grin spreading across its cheeks. He kept staring at me so intently it almost looked like he was piercing into my soul. He slid his dirty hand against the glass, waving me hello in an unnaturally slow motion. At that point, it happened. My phone battery died, turning off the flashlight and leaving me in total darkness. I felt my heart in my throat. I had never been more scared in my entire life. My whole body was quivering and shaking in fear. When I heard the car door opening, I lost it. I screamed. I screamed like a little girl as I somehow managed to unlock the garage door and bolt outside, climbing up the driveway ramp. By that time, heavy rain had started pouring down. I hopped over the gate and ran to the nearest house, yelling like a lunatic for the neighbors to rush outside. They came out in shock, and I explained to them the whole situation, almost out of breath and soaking wet. In the meantime, I heard sirens in the distance. 2 police cars rolled down the street, and I practically ran into the officer's arms, screaming that there were 3 strangers in my house. 4 agents went into my house, guns drawn, while another one took my description of the events. Those 3 men were all gone, though, and to this day, I don't think they've ever been caught. Some antiques which held some value were stolen, however. I must say it was no big deal for my family. For the remainder of the night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept tossing and turning, jumping at the slightest sounds, ruminating relentlessly on the horrific experience. But I kid you not, another chilling surprise was lying in wait. When morning came, I spotted a small piece of paper sticking out of the edge of my bed. I picked it up and went frozen stiff. The following words were written: "Bye bye beauty, you look cute when you sleep." Way back when I was a teenager, my friend's house was broken into. My mom was out of town, and I was at my friend Acer's house. We lived in a middle-class to upper-class neighborhood in the suburbs. Nothing super fancy, just a pretty average American home. All the houses looked similar in design, and they all had the same cookie-cutter, average-sized yard. Friend Acer lived right down the street, and I wanted to hang out over there and sleep over because I didn't like to stay home alone at night, and my mom wasn't really sure if I was ready for it yet either. Quite frankly, I was 11 years old, and I was a pretty shy and timid kid that was always sucked into the Xbox. I didn't play sports, and my dad wasn't in the picture very much. I was kind of a mama's boy, as embarrassing as that is to admit, but it's the truth. I was scared to stay home alone for a whole night. It was okay, though, because Acer's parents let me sleep over. Acer's parents, Beck and Irina, were really cool. It was a Saturday night, and they were also having company over. They were grilling out and having some drinks by the fire while Acer and I and a few of his younger cousins ran around the yard, playing catch, jumping on the trampoline, and swimming in their pool. After a few hours of being kids and bouncing off the walls, we grew tired, so we hung out inside for a bit. Then eventually, we made our way outside for an hour or so to hang out with the adults until our curfew came up. I would say around 11 o'clock, his parents made us go inside to get ready for bed. They put a movie on for all of us kids in the basement, and we set up a bunch of sleeping bags. We were watching some random movie, I don't remember what it was, but after a while, I fell asleep. I'm a light sleeper, so it wasn't a surprise when I woke up to one of the doors creeping open in the basement, along with some heavy footsteps, which sounded like they were coming from the stairs. I lifted my head up to see what was going on, but I couldn't see much. It was really dark down there, and I figured it was one of Acer's little cousins maybe just using the restroom or something, so I laid back down. I rolled over and went back to sleep, but within a matter of minutes, I woke to a pounding sound. I couldn't tell what the banging noise was, but I could tell it was coming from behind us, towards the stairs. Acer's basement was a decent size, and we were in the living room part of it, but on the other side, there was a bar and like 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. I thought the noise was coming from downstairs, but I wasn't totally sure. I thought that it might have been one of the adults and that maybe they were just grabbing something from downstairs, so I tried to close my eyes again. It was really dark down there, and I didn't expect it to be a stranger either. That, or I thought that maybe one of the adults went to the restroom as well. I didn't have a phone, so I couldn't check the time or get a hold of anyone. I wasn't really sure I needed to anyways. I sat and listened for a while, though, and I couldn't hear the adults outside partying anymore. Maybe they were done for the night and coming in to check on us, I thought. You remember when you were a kid and thought there were monsters under your bed or in the closet? That fear you would feel, but deep down, you knew there was nothing to be scared about because you knew it wasn't real. Kind of felt like that. I went back to sleep one more time, but this time, what happened was far more disturbing than the previous times I'd been woken up. I woke up to a man on top of me, shaking me and trying to grab me. Other kids and Acer all ran to get the adults for help. I put up a fight, but eventually, the strange man grabbed me full on and started to run. I was being kidnapped. I did everything I could to try to get away, kicking, biting, scratching, and I even tried to dig my fingers through the man's eyes, but nothing was working. I was hopeless. That is, until Acer's dad chased him down and hit him in the head with a fire extinguisher. We both fell straight to the ground on the sidewalk, and I hit my head on the cement. Somehow, the man managed to stand up and run away, and since he had a mask on, we had no way of identifying him. I wonder if things would have ended differently had the other adults been there still. Maybe they would have chased the man down and beat his ass, and he would have got arrested, and I could actually sleep at night. But for the longest of times, I couldn't sleep. The same nightmare came to me over and over and would replay in my head. We think that the man let himself inside through the sliding glass door in the basement. I wonder how long he was standing there, planning the attack. If I would have listened to my gut, maybe things would have turned out differently, but I actually ended up with a concussion anyway. Nothing too severe, but still a concussion. Ever since that day, no matter what it is, I always listen to my intuition, and I suggest you do the same. It's always better to be safe than sorry, believe me. I'm also really glad that Acer's parents were still awake, or maybe I would have been murdered or kidnapped or even worse. It's all too hard to say, but I've been thinking about it non-stop for a while now, and I'm still paranoid. This happened in August of last year. I had taken a week off from work for a staycation at home. I had been living alone for the past few months after my roommate moved out, but I'd been working too much to really enjoy the space and freedom of living alone. This week was supposed to be my relaxing, me time that I never got to have. Unfortunately, it could not have been further from that. It was my second day off, and I was just chilling, watching TV, eating nice home-cooked meals, all of that kind of stuff, when I heard someone walk up to my front porch. It was midday, so I thought maybe the mailman or just some solicitor. But as I stayed sitting on the couch for a few minutes, I realized they still hadn't knocked or rang the doorbell. I never heard them walk away, so it got me curious. I got up and went over to the door to look out the peephole. Sure enough, someone was still on my porch. It was a man looking to be in his mid-30s, wearing a light sweatshirt and black jeans. He wasn't in front of the door, though. He was off to the side, looking around like he was searching for something. I thought of opening the door, but I was too nervous to confront him, so I just watched. After 40 seconds, the guy walked away quickly and got into a parked car on the road by my neighbor's house. Once I saw him drive away, I went out to investigate. Everything looked normal to me, at least everything in the area the man was looking around. I went back inside and mostly forgot about it. Within the hour, I took a nap, then made dinner a few hours later, and finally turned on a movie to finish off the night with. Sometime in the middle of it, there was a knock at the door. I paused the movie and went to see who it was. It was that man from earlier, this time standing in front of the door and seeming to be waiting for me to answer. I cracked the door open just enough to talk through. "Hey, I was hoping you'd help me out with something." I'd ask someone else, but nobody would answer, the man said right away with a big smile. "What do you need?" I asked. He went on to tell me this elaborate story about his car breaking down right next to my house. He pointed at it, and I immediately knew it was the same car I saw him drive away in earlier. Then he said all he needed was to use my phone to make a quick call. Knowing this was some sort of scam or something, I denied him right away and closed the door. I then looked through the peephole to make sure he left, but he didn't. His face grew excessively angry, and he banged on the door again. I yelled through the door that I'd call the cops if he didn't leave. He stood and thought for a moment, then hurried off, but not to his car. He walked around to the left side of the house. Fearing this was going to escalate, I dialed 911 and told them about the situation. Thank God I did, because not even a minute later, a sudden crash came from the dining room. I ran over to see what it was and saw that he'd smashed the window and was crawling through it. I tried to run for the garage to get in my car, but the man was quick, chasing me down half the house before grabbing me and holding me still. I fought back, kicking and punching, but he completely overpowered me. He told me through his clenched jaw to be quiet and insisted that I stop fighting while he dragged me to the front door and opened it. Once I knew what he was doing, I only started fighting harder. As he tried to bring me closer to his car, someone walking their dog on the other side of the road saw us and came running over. Before he even reached us, the man let go of me and sprinted to his car and drove away. It all happened so fast. Once the police arrived, they helped calm me down and got all the information I could give them. Apparently, it wasn't enough, though. He was never found. What's creepier is that the police think the first time I saw him come by wasn't actually his first time. They think I may have caught him collecting some sort of camera or mic he'd set up on my house to spy on me. He hasn't been back that I know of, but I plan to move out anyway just to be safe. Whatever his plan was, I don't want to risk finding out. I live in a townhome in the middle of a relatively small city. It's very small and outdated, but I live alone, so it's the best I can afford. I worked late this night, getting home sometime around 8 or 9. Pulling up my shared driveway, I noticed the townhome connected to mine had its front door wide open. All the lights in the house were off, though, which made me think they must have accidentally left it open and then gone to sleep. I made fun of them in my head and went inside my house, not thinking much else about it. I got out some frosted flakes and ate while watching Netflix, then forced myself to go to bed because I had to be up early for my morning shift tomorrow. Going to my bedroom, which happened to have a connecting wall to my neighbors, I heard a few thumps come from inside their place. My neighbors usually don't make any noise, so hearing anything from them was a rare occurrence. I just hoped they wouldn't keep me up and turned off the lights and hopped in bed. I laid there with my eyes closed for several minutes, trying to drift into sleep when the most terrifying sound instantly shook me up, my front door being smashed in. It was a single violent hit. I jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway. There was wood debris all over the floor, and the front door was wide open. But whoever did it must have been moving quickly because they weren't there. I heard some footsteps running through the living room, and at this point, I could tell there was more than one person. I tried to run back to my bedroom, but a man screamed at me to stop. I turned to face two large men, both wearing masks and hoodies. One was holding a baseball bat, and the other held some sort of metal ramming tool, which must have been used to bust open the door. This next part was chaotic as they yelled commands at me and forced me to the ground. I didn't even try to fight back because I knew it would only put me in more danger. One of them held me down aggressively, pressing my head on the floor, while the other went around the house and shoved stuff in his backpack. I was panicking, breathing heavily, and trying to convince them to get off me and just let me stay out of their way. I probably should have just shut up and stayed quiet, but it was hard to think straight. Somewhere around 2 to 3 minutes in, the man that was grabbing stuff came running back to the hallway, yelling at me and the other guy about something outside. The man got off me and ran over to the window. Then they both came running back and pushed me down as I was trying to get up. They looked full of rage as they started attacking and threatening me before trying to run out the back door, but they were too late. For cops had surrounded the house, and seconds later, they forced the men to give up. As it turns out, the men broke into my neighbor's townhome too. They weren't home at the time, but when they pulled in, they immediately called the cops, which was how they were able to help me. The two men turned out to be just regular guys trying to make some quick money. Aside from the smashed front door and a few bruises, I was all right. I still think it was stupid of them to attack me instead of just making a run for it at the end, but I'm sure either way they were screwed. It was by far the most terrifying thing I'd ever been through, but I'm extremely lucky to have had it end up the way it did, with them in prison. I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a normal family-sized home, which was relevant when I had roommates. But when they moved out and it just became me living here, I had nothing to do with the extra space. It was technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only used 2 of the bedrooms. One is my main bedroom and one is the game room. The other 2 rooms were on the far end of the upstairs hallway. One had a few storage boxes in it, and the other was completely empty. After getting out of work at 9 o'clock, I picked up Wendy's on the way home and pretty much went right to the game room. I was off tomorrow, so what better to do than game all night? I put my headphones on and loaded up COD, but before I had time to even load into a match, I thought I heard something that sounded like a knock at the front door. I took my headset off and listened, but not hearing anything and figuring they would have knocked again if there was someone there, I went back to my game. Probably a whole 2 hours went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like either a knock or a door closing or something like that, but with my headphones on and with my room door closed, it was way too quiet for me to tell. I got up and opened the door, looking out into the hallway and waiting for that sound to come again. After a minute, though, I went downstairs and looked out the front door. Nobody was outside my house, and everything seemed normal. Having been hearing these sounds, though, I obviously made sure the door was locked before going back upstairs. To be a bit more cautious, I left my room door open this time, so if it happened again, maybe I'd hear it better. I put my headset back on and continued gaming. I played through a whole round, so like 20-ish minutes. As the game ended and I leaned back in my chair, a figure rushed past the open doorway, just off to the side of my view. I immediately threw my headphones off and jumped from my chair, horrified and unsure what to do. I just stared at the doorway. I didn't get the courage to finally move for several minutes. When I looked into the hallway, though, and eventually the rest of the house, nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When police came and investigated, it was clear that the person had been hiding and very likely living in the empty room. I hadn't been in there for weeks or maybe even months, so all this time they could have been just on the other side of the wall from me, and I had no idea. It's really scary to think about, especially if I'd happened to confront him. There's no saying what he would have done. It was the middle of the summer. I was 11 years old and my younger brother was 8. We were outside playing various games with other kids in our neighborhood, but we finally headed home as the sun went down. Maybe once a week, our parents would go to a different restaurant around town, leaving my younger brother and me home alone. Most of the time, they'd tell us before they went out, but if we were outside playing, sometimes they'd just leave us to our game. When we got back home and no one was there, we assumed this was the case. Confirming this was a note left on the kitchen counter. My younger brother and I both went to the living room to watch TV, something we usually did before bed. After half an hour, it had gotten completely dark outside. Just then, I heard the doorbell ring, followed by knocking. At first, I thought it was our parents getting back, but it definitely wasn't normal for them to use the front door, much less not have a key for it. The chances of the garage door opener they had not working them forgetting a key were extremely low. Although I realized it was still possible, I left the living room and went up to the front door to see who it was. As I approached the door, I heard a man's voice yell that he was selling Girl Scout cookies. I was extremely confused considering the time of day. I looked through the peephole and saw a grown man, completely alone, with no cookies in hand and not with his daughter, as I was expecting. The man yelled out once more before moving his hand to the door handle. My heart dropped, realizing that we had forgotten to lock the door when coming in for the night. The door handle slowly started turning, and I quickly engaged the deadlock. A clicking sound echoed out. It was too loud. Clearly, the man had heard it and now knew someone was inside. I waited a minute before once again looking through the peephole. The man was now looking through our living room window directly at my younger brother, who was completely unaware of what was going on. From where he now stood, I could make out a gun holstered on the left side of his waist. I ran back to the living room and closed the blinds. I told my brother we should get some ice cream downstairs in the basement. I needed to get him away from any windows, but I knew that if he knew what was going on, he would freak out. He agreed, and we went downstairs. I silently locked the basement door behind us. We ate our ice cream, and eventually, I could hear the hum of the garage door opening from upstairs, signifying that my parents were back home. Later, when my brother wasn't around, I told them what had happened. They were horrified and understandably called the police. The police inspected the place, and one of the first things they noticed was how the front door's lock had clearly been tampered with, basically confirming the man had ill intent and was trying to break in. What he planned to do when he got inside, though, I can't say for sure, and neither can the police. The man was never identified. To this day, my younger brother doesn't even know this whole event took place. We received a chilling account from a brave individual who endured a harrowing encounter with enigmatic beings from another world. In this video, we delve into the spine-tingling story of their abduction and the shocking twist that left us questioning the nature of such abductions. I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to share an experience with you, something that happened to me one fateful night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a late weekend night, and I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of road surrounded by farms and dense forestry. The full moon bathed the landscape in an eerie silver glow, and I was deep in the heart of nowhere. As I continued my journey, I noticed an unusual light in my rearview mirror. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was either another vehicle or the radiant full moon casting unusual shadows. However, my unease grew when a sharp beam of light suddenly engulfed my car. Panic coursed through my veins as my vehicle began losing power, the engine sputtering to a halt, and every electrical system shutting down. With trepidation, I stepped out of my car to investigate the source of this mysterious light. What I encountered next would defy all reason and logic: a flying saucer, yes, a UFO. The sight was unlike anything I had ever seen. It had landed right in the middle of the road. My heart raced as I watched in awe and terror as three small gray beings emerged from the craft. I know this might sound unreal, but the experience was real and simply terrifying. These beings were small, no taller than 3 feet, with slender bodies and a gray complexion. Their heads were disproportionately large, featuring oversized pitch-black almond-shaped eyes that shimmered with an otherworldly intelligence. They only had the slightest of noses and what seemed like slits for ears. Their mouths were also subtle lipless slits. Their fingers were long and delicate. These small but scary beings were clad in sleek, form-fitting bodysuits that bore an eerie jet-black hue. The fabric seemed to adhere closely to their diminutive frames, emphasizing their slender and otherworldly appearances. These suits appeared to be made of a material unlike any I had ever encountered, possessing a peculiar sheen that hinted at an advanced and unfamiliar technology. The texture of the suits had an almost metallic quality to them, adding to the otherworldly aura that surrounded these beings. It was as if these beings, dressed in their enigmatic black suits, were emissaries from a realm that defied human comprehension, leaving me with more questions than answers. As they approached me, walking with an uncanny grace, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, as if they were communicating with me through some form of telepathy. They moved in unison, their movements fluid and synchronized. Without uttering a word, they conveyed a sense of urgency, gently guiding me toward the entrance of their craft. It was as if they had the ability to exert control over my actions, making resistance futile. The hypnotic spell they cast upon me left me with no choice but to follow their lead, stepping through the metallic threshold of their enigmatic vessel and into an entirely new and unsettling reality. Inside the alien craft, I found myself in a room that defied any earthly description. The walls seemed to be constructed from a seamless silvery metallic material, casting an otherworldly shimmer across the entire chamber. There were no discernible corners or edges, creating an unsettling feeling of disorientation. The room was bathed in a soft bluish light that emitted from concealed sources, casting eerie shadows in every direction. In the center of the room lay a peculiar silvery metal slab, its surface smooth and polished to a mirror-like sheen. The slab had restraints of an unknown design, composed of a material that resembled a translucent gel-like substance. These restraints seemed to respond to the touch of the aliens, conforming perfectly to the contours of my body as they secured me in place. It was as if the slab itself was a living entity, adapting to their will. Surrounding the slab were an array of strange and intricate instruments, unlike anything found in human technology. Some emitted faint rhythmic hums, while others displayed holographic readouts that I couldn't comprehend. Tubes and wires snaked across the room, connecting to various devices, and it became clear that I was the subject of their experiments. The atmosphere was charged with an otherworldly energy, and my fear was palpable as I lay helpless on the metallic surface, unable to comprehend the full extent of what was about to transpire. The aliens surrounded me. While I was on the slab, one of them pulled down a mechanical arm with a kind of needle extending from it. He brought it towards my eyes. At first, I freaked out, but then my faith kicked in. As I am a spiritual person, I knew I had only one resort of help to turn to. It is because of my faith that I discovered a peculiar phenomenon. Every time I called out to my Creator and began to pray, something incredible happened. It was as if a divine presence filled the room, and I became certain that the Creator Spirit was with me. My prayers seemed to unnerve my captors, and I realized that my faith was a powerful weapon against them. Their fear was palpable, and it was evident that they were afraid of something far greater than themselves. It seemed to terrify them. With each prayer, they backed away, unable to withstand the spiritual force that protected me. As I continued to pray fervently, an astonishing and unexpected sight unfolded before my eyes. One of the little gray aliens, the one closest to me, suddenly exhibited signs of intense fear and distress. Its large, almond-shaped eyes widened even further, and it began to emit high-pitched, distressed sounds that I can only describe as a mixture of chattering and whimpering. In a shocking turn of events, the alien's body language conveyed sheer terror, and to my astonishment, it began to involuntarily urinate, causing its tight suit to become soaked with a pale liquid. The liquid pooled around its feet, creating a strange and unsettling scene within the sterile metallic chamber. It was as if my prayers had triggered a profound and unexpected reaction within the creature, revealing a vulnerability I could never have anticipated. This bizarre and surreal moment served as a reminder that, despite their advanced technology and seemingly superior knowledge, these extraterrestrial beings were not immune to fear. There were forces beyond their understanding that could instill terror even in the most enigmatic of creatures. It was a turning point in my harrowing ordeal, as I realized that my faith had the power to influence and protect me in ways I could never have imagined. In a twist of fate, they eventually released me, dumping me by the side of the road not far from where they had abducted me. As I watched their craft disappear into the night sky, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of awe and gratitude for the divine intervention that had saved me from an unimaginable fate. This experience has forever changed my perspective on the mysteries of the universe. It serves as a reminder that even in the face of the unknown and the terrifying, there is a force greater than anything we can comprehend, a force that shields us from the darkest of terrors if we turn towards it. My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few background details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so I had to go out through hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end before I was supposed to. If I got a mosquito bite, I had to deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then I passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echo suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, 2 people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit, the other, I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker, grayish skin. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like 2 old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, and they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue. Though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc., I can recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said to myself that that was a messed up dream and went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw, 2 perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin and impossibly perfect. There was some clear hard gel on the top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with liquid Band-Aid, but neither of those things seemed prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation. I slept on a staple or a paper clip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So, I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paper clip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately, blood welled up, and the skin was jagged from all 3 objects, and the width of all cuts was thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be. There were only 2 people on campus rich enough to have a digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the Photoshop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debates sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done and went to 2 different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial X-ray. I had long since forgotten my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the first X-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been rather than the opposite side. No, I was told, the X-ray was actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an X-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant there was some damage or irregularity with the X-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist, and had another X-ray done. You guessed it, the square was there in the exact same place. This time, I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time, the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an X-ray anomaly," and she leaned closer and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they used for an X-ray were damaged in exactly the same spots and exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about X-rays. But after that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know, we do this all the time to other species. We chase them in helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperatures, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection or preservation of habitat or species, like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another X-ray 20 years later. I have tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Surprisingly, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science and nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent to be asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. I worked from 9 to 5, then came home, ate, and then worked on the old house to get it ready to sell. One night, after an exceptionally long and rough night of working on the house, I was on my way home when I saw in the sky something that routinely is not there. I stopped to watch the object only to see it not move at all. Now, realize this is around 1 a.m., and it's not a hot air balloon or anything like that, especially since I have never seen one in my area of Ohio. What I was looking at was an oval. It was wider than it was tall. The object, as many people explained, was not giving off light but was illuminated, if that makes any sense. I was so tired I almost wanted to shrug it off, but I just couldn't for some reason. Not only was it way too bizarre, but what I had been wanting for the last 48 years was happening right before me, my first and so far only UFO sighting. To say I felt spooked would be an understatement. I got back into my car and drove the short 1,000 feet or so to get to my driveway and to the safety of my new home. I knew there were details I was not able to see because of the way the craft was illuminated. Then it dawned on me, nobody's gonna believe me. So, at 1:30 a.m. on a school night, I went into the house and scared my daughter and son by waking them up to witness what was in the sky. I hoped to God it would be there still, and sure enough, it was sitting right there where I left it. I am covered in goosebumps just recalling my daughter's reaction. My son was a huge skeptic, but even at the age of 12, when he witnessed it, looking back he knows what it was. I saw fear in his eyes. He stayed out with us for about a minute or two, then went back inside. My daughter and I were almost speechless. It was beautiful in a way, but we both agreed that it gave off a feeling of fear or dread, like we were not supposed to be seeing this. Then it struck me, I should get some binoculars. I happened to know right where they were because I did most of the boxing for our move. I grabbed the binoculars and was stunned at what I saw. The best I could describe it was it looked totally old on the bottom, like it was made from old clad iron ships long ago, pounded out metal, like with rivets and seams. The top looked very modern, I guess you could say. I remember it had something that resembled what I would call headlights on the back window, like some old cars. I also remember the top almost being shaped like a genie's lamp. My daughter looked through the binoculars and had a terribly similar description. Then I saw something that freaked me out even further. It now looked as though the craft was sitting on a long, thin, yellowish pedestal. I could not figure out what I was now seeing. I gave the binoculars to my daughter, by the way, she was 16 at the time, and asked her to explain to me what she saw at this time, what had changed. I could hear the absolute fright and quiver in her voice. I will never forget what she said, "Dad, there's a beam of light coming out from under whatever it is. I'm scared, Dad. I think we should go in." We could not shake that feeling of fright and the feeling that we should have never seen what we did that night. Both of our bedroom windows faced out directly where this craft could be seen. I found out later my daughter stayed up until morning on live video chat with her friends, absolutely terrified. After showering, I laid in bed exhausted but overwhelmed by what we just saw. It was at this point that I noticed the craft was moving, but at such a slow rate it was undetectable until I was able to compare it to something stationary, which was my vertical windowsill. I will never forget that dull, eerie, pale yellow light this craft illuminated. I forgot to mention that if you held out your arm, the craft was just slightly larger than the width of your thumb, if that makes any sense. I was told later that that is quite large. Eventually, the craft traveled out of sight, and I crashed from exhaustion. It was late afternoon, and I was probably around 10 years of age at the time. I was on my way home from my school football when I realized an odd man was walking along my street. At first, I stopped walking and examined the man for a moment. There was something about him that just did not sit right with me, the way he moved, the way he looked, the way he was looking at things in such definitive detail. I could not really put my finger on it. All I knew was that his presence made me feel extremely uncomfortable. I went and sat behind a car so he could not see me, and I waited for a few moments as he walked into somebody's driveway out of view. I ran back to my house, which was only a few doors down. It did not take me too long to reach my driveway. However, when I stepped onto my driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I did not look back. I rushed into my house to tell my mom and grandparents what I had just seen. Of course, they just brushed it off and made an excuse for it to not be some kind of alien man. I could not be bothered to stand around and try to convince them, so I went up to my room and stared. I stared out the window for a while, and then there they were. My window looks out into the driveway, so I could see him clearly. He was tall, maybe 6'5" or so, and extremely skinny. His neck was abnormally long, and his shoulders were narrow. He wore a white sports jersey and a pair of baggy jeans. The top of his head was large and veiny. Overall, he was a weird-looking person. I bolted downstairs with the most intense adrenaline rush I had ever had to tell my family. Out of breath, I stuttered out my words, and they walked out into the living room to take a look for themselves. My mom's face turned pale as she stared into the eyes of the person who was now stood up right against the living room window, so close, in fact, that you could see the condensation from his breath on the glass. He gently pulled up a notebook from his pocket and started writing. As this happened, everything was quiet, and everybody was frozen in place. It was the eeriest atmosphere I have ever experienced. A few seconds passed, and he finished taking his notes. He strolled back to the driveway. Still pale, my mom turned to me with an expression of terror and complexion. The only thing we knew to do from here was to contact the police, which we did. However, they looked for this man all over the neighborhood and could not find him anywhere. Overall, this experience has probably been one of the most bizarre and terrifying I have ever had. I am hoping someone can help me figure out what happened here. I'm hoping somebody can tell me who or what this thing was. I've read a lot of things online, and this sounds a lot like abductions I've heard in the past. Luckily, I didn't get abducted, but what do you guys think? When I was 18, I was very immature and naive. I was kind of a jerk when I was on the road, honking whenever I got impatient, borderline cutting people off. Looking back now, it was very stupid. If I ever have kids, I'll be that much more strict with them as far as their driving. That being said, I did drive a lot for someone my age. I went away to school 5 hours away from home. No matter what day of the week, traffic always gets atrocious the closer I get to home. So during breaks, I'll drive home at night to avoid this. What goes from a 4 to 5 hour drive down to a 3-hour drive? It was the beginning of winter break as the fall semester just ended. All my friends left for home on the same day. I just waited till later on in the night to head out because there's nothing I hate more than traffic. I used to drive a Mazda 3 that I would beat the ever-living crap out of, and admittedly, I used to be known for driving my car to a near-empty tank consistently. People would comment on it whenever they'd be in the car with me, and I'd always assure them that the car would still have at least 30 miles to go even after the needle would hit E. I found out the night I was driving home from school that I was wrong. I was only like an hour into my drive on the interstate. The needle was on E, and I was pushing my luck waiting for a gas station sign instead of looking up the nearest one on the map. The car started making these weird sounds suddenly and jolting, and that's when I realized I may have actually run the tank empty this time. I got off the first exit ramp and hoped it would lead right to a gas station. This exit was dark though, with no street lights, and there were just woods on either side. I was scared to slow down and lose my speed because I didn't know if I'd have enough gas to find a gas station. I blew through the stop sign at the end of the ramp and made a sharp left turn on the intersecting road, which was another dark road surrounded by woods. I was screwed. The car eventually came to a stop, and the engine died. Things only got worse when I took out my phone and saw I had no bars. I have T-Mobile, which is the worst possible reception anywhere far from a major city. I tried calling 911 because I was stupid and thought that 911 works even without reception. Of course, it didn't. I was terrified because I didn't know what to do. I turned on my hazard lights and just waited for someone to pass by. It was a long time before I saw headlights approaching. When I did, I flashed my headlights at them, and they passed me, made a U-turn, then pulled up on the grass behind me. I didn't know who was getting out of that car, though, and I was an 18-year-old defenseless girl. I just cracked the window down a little bit as this man approached my car. I told him I needed help. I ran out of gas. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest gas station. He was this bald guy with glasses on. He kind of looked trustworthy. I had no other apparent options but to accept his offer. I got out of the car and followed him to his car, making sure to lock my doors first. His car was a black Honda, year probably a 2010. It smelled funky in his car. I couldn't pin what the smell could be, though. He banged another U-turn and started driving in the direction he was driving before. He made conversation with me, asking where I was from and basic questions. I was honest with him that I was driving home from school. He said he lived in the area and that they don't get too many out-of-towners getting off the interstate for this quiet little town. The route we were taking lacked any buildings anywhere. It was just woods everywhere. I asked if he knew of any gas stations, and he said yeah, just a ways up the road. I started hearing bumping and thumping coming from the back of the vehicle. It sounded like the trunk. At first, I thought it was maybe just bumps in the road or a loose object in the trunk. He seemed to keep talking like he wouldn't stop. Finally, we got to a sort of town-looking area. There were some lights and buildings at last, a diner, and a few small houses. There was a red light at the first intersection since I got in his car. We came to a stop, and for the first time, there was silence. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone screaming in the trunk, followed by thumps and bangs. I looked at the man, who looked at me. In a split second, I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the door, and ran while at the same time, he tried grabbing me and pulling me back into the car. I heard him get out as well, but instead of chasing me, he ran to close his passenger side door. Then I heard him floor it down the street. I ran into the diner and asked for help, making a scene. I used their phone to call 911. I waited there, and it became this whole huge thing with multiple police showing up to the diner to take a report. Given the gravity of the report that I was making, that I heard someone in the trunk of the car, they had to get every last detail for me about the man's car, his appearance, and where he picked me up. I was also given a ride back to my car so that they could also include the pickup location in the report. They also helped me get a hold of AAA, which eventually would come to my location to fill my car with gas. This was overall the scariest experience of my life. I was shaken to the core the whole rest of the ride home. I hope they found that man. I hope whoever was in that trunk is still alive today. For all I know, that man could have been bringing me to his house or somewhere else, and I was just lucky I had a chance to get out at that red light. I live in Burke County, North Carolina, in Morganton. I'm used to the quiet lifestyle that comes with living in a rural place. You get some weird characters here and there, but it's usually nothing too bad. I own a nice plot of land with my husband. My work schedule fluctuates. Sometimes I work days, sometimes I work nights. This happened on a night that I was on my way home after a night shift, so it had to be like 4 a.m. My phone was almost dead. I was hungry. I was tired, and I just wanted to get some food and head home. I stopped at the gas station to get $10 worth of gas and also a packaged sandwich, which I proceeded to eat inside the gas station cafe. Some sketchy guy was eyeing me for a little until he left the building without buying anything. After eating, I went outside to fill up the gas and then got back in the car. The smell of gas was extra pungent for some reason. These roads are very dark and twisty at night, so I was driving slow, especially since I was tired after a long day of work. Then something unexpected happened. The needle on the gas gauge suddenly dropped to E, and the low gas light came on and beeped. I had no idea what was going on. I'm not a car person and I'd never run out of gas before this. Plus, the needle just suddenly dropped. I thought at first that the computer was glitching, so I pulled over and restarted the car, but the needle was still on E. I tried to continue driving, but the engine died. I started having a panic attack. I called my husband first thing, and thank God he picked up. I asked him how did my car run out of gas after I just filled up, and as I got out of the car, I smelt gasoline. I told him this, and he said it sounds like I have a leak. He told me he'd head right over and he'd call our roadside assistance company. But then I heard a car coming with no headlights, and suddenly it stopped not far behind my car. I suddenly thought to bring up that sketchy guy who was watching me at the gas station and asked my husband if there was a chance he did something to my car. My husband's tone suddenly changed to sounding more concerned and worried. He said yes, there's a chance that he may have cut my fuel line. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was I needed to run. I took my keys out of the ignition and shut the door and locked it so that the headlights would turn off. My phone was on like 2%, so I told him to text me when he's close. I ran off the road and towards the first house I could find. I ran down the long driveway and up the property to the front door. All the lights in the house were off. I still rang the bell multiple times anyway. Eventually, a light turned on and then the door opened. A man in his 60s opened the door. He looked like he was just woken up. I asked him to let me in to hide and charge my phone. After a bit of explaining, he opened the door fully and let me in. I asked him for an iPhone charger, and he said he'd go look for one, then asked me to take a seat in the living room. I sat down, still in my nurse scrubs, feeling a mix of emotions. The man called out from the kitchen asking me if I wanted some water. I said yes, please. Little did he know, I saw his reflection in a mirror in the living room that gave visibility into the kitchen. I saw him fill a cup with water, then I know for a fact I saw him drop something into the water. He walked out of view of the mirror, but the faucet was still running. It ran for a solid 30 more seconds before he turned it off. He came back into the living room with a glass of water and handed it to me. I thanked him, and he sat down and just looked at me, then asked me to explain the situation again. I replied to him, I just really need a charger so that I could contact my husband. He said all right and went upstairs. I checked my phone, and it was on 1%. I used that remaining battery to send my current location to my husband just in case. I then smelt the glass of water, and although it didn't smell like anything, I knew he put something in it. Now I had to make the decision of whether I should leave or not. On one hand, I needed to charge my phone badly. On the other, I was 99% sure he did something to this water. I heard him walking back down the stairs, and he said he doesn't have any iPhone chargers since he has an Android. After he said this, I got up and walked straight for the door. I'm not an idiot. Once outside, I ran back down the driveway to the road. I felt like throwing up. I couldn't believe two separate potential incidents from two different men happened in one night. I crept along the side of the road behind the trees. I took out my phone and sent my updated location, and right around now was when my battery died. I waited until I saw the familiar headlights of my husband's truck. I went out waving my arms, and thank God it was him. I got inside the truck and let all my emotions out, crying to him about what I just went through. He brought us to my car, and there was no longer a car behind mine. My back window was shattered, though, and it appeared someone had gotten into the back seat, but nothing of high value was left in my car to steal anyway. My car battery was also now dead. When I told my husband about the man who tried to potentially drug me, he was so furious he wanted to go break down his door. But I told him no, let's just wait for the tow truck to come. We waited quite a while before it came. My car was towed to my dealership, where they would take the car in the next day. My husband was right. My car was vandalized, and the fuel line was cut completely. Thank God I was off the next few days because I needed some time to mentally recover from this night. The idea that twice in one night I was almost a victim of some sketchy men, I just couldn't get over. This happened way back in 2006. I was 17 and living in Uvalde, Texas, a very low-income neighborhood, the kind you'll find sprawled out all over the place in rural Texas when you're not right outside of a city. The closest city to me was San Antonio. I was going to some local community college because that's all my parents could afford for me. One of my best friends from high school, Bodie, moved to San Antonio to go to San Antonio College. He was living in some small apartment a little outside of the city with a roommate. His girlfriend would also often stay with him. Since the city is only really an hour and a half away, I would visit him all the time. He invited me this one weekend to come crash for the night, so I took my trusty old 1995 Toyota pickup truck. Just kidding, the thing was a piece of crap. The gas gauge didn't even work on it. I'd have to always just keep track of when the last time I filled the tank up was, then reset the trip mileage. I took Route 90, which was a straight shot from Uvalde to San Antonio. I was on the road at like 2:40 p.m. on a Friday, and there was no traffic at all. I got to Bodie at a reasonable time. His girlfriend wouldn't be getting there until tomorrow, so tonight we were going to go out. We stopped at a liquor store and drank in his apartment for a while with his roommate. Then the three of us went to this dive bar that would kind of look the other way with fake IDs. That was basically our night. We got back to their apartment around 2 a.m. after getting food. I slept on the couch. The next day would have almost been the same thing, but Bodie and his girlfriend were having issues all day. As the two of them got drunker as the night progressed, she started yelling at him in front of me, and it got really awkward and uncomfortable. I didn't really have much to drink that day because I was already iffy about staying the night with her there. I eventually decided I would just head back home. I said goodbye to everyone and started my journey home. It was very late at night. I want to guess midnight, maybe a little earlier. Route 90 was deserted at this time, so I would fly for my pickup standards. But suddenly, the engine started sputtering. I felt my heart completely drop as I realized I forgot to fill up the tank. I slowed down, but it was too late. The engine cut. I pulled to the side of the road and tried starting it a few times, but it did no good. I took out my cell phone, which was equally as shitty as my truck, and tried to get a signal. No shot. I couldn't even call for help. I had to just put my hazards on and hope a good Samaritan would pass. You wouldn't believe how long I sat on the side of the road before seeing headlights. I waved my arms as the car approached, but it zoomed past me, ignoring me. This happened again after another 10 minutes or so. I was starting to feel hopeless, like maybe I should just sleep in my car and wait till sunrise to get help. So that's what I was going to do. I got inside my car, took the key out of the ignition to cut the battery, and just angled my seat back to go to sleep. I would hear the occasional car zooming past, like once every 10 minutes, but it didn't feel worth waving people down in the dark. It seemed sketchy for myself and to the people in the cars. But when I was starting to actually drift away to sleep, a car door closing from behind me woke me up. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a car pulled up behind me with its headlights off. I turned around now to get a better look. There was some big pickup truck, but I couldn't see anyone inside of it, nor did I see anyone outside of it. Maybe someone pulled over to help. I got out of the car and said, "Excuse me," to no response. I walked closer to the truck just to confirm no one was inside. Then I walked back to my car. This was weird. I looked towards the trees on the side of the road. Maybe someone was pissing in the woods. I went back inside my car and locked the door. This was just too weird. Suddenly, there was a tap at my window. I jumped. I looked to see a man looking down at me into the car, smiling. I didn't do anything yet. He said, "Hey, buddy, need a hand?" I lowered the window a crack and said, "Hey, I ran out of gas." The man said, "That's quite the predicament. Step out and give me a hand with this real quick." When he said this, I thought he meant help him with a gas jug to fill up my tank or something, honestly. So I stepped out of the truck and shut the door, expecting him to lead me to his truck. But he stood there, looked down at me because he was much taller, still smiling, and said, "I need you to empty your pockets, please." It took me a second to process what he meant. I was literally a broke college student driving a piece of pickup truck. I wasn't about to get robbed of the only cash I had in my phone. I ran for it in the direction of the trees. I'm small but fast. I turned around and saw he was chasing after me. Once I made it into the trees, I zigzagged all over the place until I seemed to lose him. Then I crouched behind a big tree to catch my breath. When I heard him approaching closer, I quieted my breath. I heard him say out loud, "I'll kill you, you piece of." I don't know if he was just saying it out loud out of anger or if he wanted me to hear it, but I was too scared to move. Even after I heard his footsteps move away, I didn't move. In fact, I stayed in this position the rest of the night, eventually laying behind this big tree up until dawn. I went back over to the highway to my truck, and the truck behind me was gone, but my truck's doors were both open. I found that my glove box had been gone through and completely emptied of anything somewhat valuable. My flannel hoodie was also taken, which had something in the pocket, I'm sure. I finally managed to wave down a good Samaritan, and he gave me a ride to the closest gas station. I bought a fuel can, filled it with gas, and the man brought me back to my car, where I filled my tank just enough to drive the truck to a gas station to fill up completely. Then I went straight home. This was a real-life learning experience for me, that there are bad people out there who will try to take advantage of you when you're in a vulnerable spot. But there are also good people, like the man who helped me. Our next story takes us from the desolate expanse of the desert to the claustrophobic darkness of a dense forest. Imagine the towering trees, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a canopy that blots out the moon and stars. The air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of rustling leaves and the snapping of twigs. It's a place of eerie beauty, but also one that can hide unspeakable horrors. A young woman driving home from a late-night shift found herself lost on a deserted road cutting through the heart of such a forest. She had taken a wrong turn, lured off the main highway by a faulty GPS signal. Now she was hopelessly lost, her phone showing no bars, and her car sputtering its last breaths as it ran out of gas. The engine died, plunging her into an oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her heart. The forest, once beautiful, now loomed around her, menacing and alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sounded like approaching footsteps. She knew staying in her car was her safest bet, but the silence of the forest was unbearable, a suffocating blanket of darkness pressing in on her. She turned on her hazard lights, there blinking a beacon of hope in the vast darkness, but the battery quickly drained, leaving her once again in darkness. Time crawled by, each minute an eternity. She dozed off, only to be jolted awake by nightmares fueled by her isolation and fear. The forest came alive with every gust of wind, the shadows seeming to dance and writhe, taking on menacing shapes in the darkness. Then she heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the woods surrounding her car. Her blood ran cold, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. She strained to listen, her senses on high alert, every muscle in her body tense with fear. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps crunching on leaves. Something was out there, something big and dangerous, circling her car like a predator stalking its prey. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the lock. She huddled in the back seat, her eyes wide with terror, her breath catching in her throat. The growls continued throughout the night, each one sending shivers down her spine. She was trapped, hunted by an unseen terror in the heart of the forest. As dawn broke, the growls finally ceased, replaced by the chirping of birds, a jarring contrast to the nightmares she had just endured. She cautiously got out of the car, her legs shaking, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. She didn't waste any time. With a desperate prayer, she started walking, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and her ears straining for any sound that might signal the return of her unseen tormentor. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled out of the woods and onto a dirt road. A pickup truck soon approached, its driver stopping to help. She had escaped the clutches of the forest, but the terror of that night, the memory of the unseen growls, would forever haunt her dreams. Our final story takes us to a desolate stretch of highway, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a barren landscape. This is not a road frequented by travelers. The few gas stations that dotted its length had long since been abandoned, their pumps dry and their windows boarded up like hollow eyes staring out at the emptiness. A young couple, eager for a weekend getaway, found themselves stranded on this forgotten highway. Their car sputtered its last as the gas gauge hit empty. They had ignored the warning signs, the lack of other cars, the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air, too caught up in their own excitement to heed these signs. Now, they were stranded. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt, the air thick with the smell of dust and despair. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. They were alone, utterly alone, in a place that felt forgotten by time. They decided to walk, hoping to find help, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. Mile after mile, they walked, the sun beating down on them relentlessly. Their throats were parched, their energy draining with each step. The highway stretched out before them, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading nowhere. As they walked, they noticed something strange, cars abandoned on the roadside, seemingly frozen in time. Some were old and rusted, others surprisingly new, their paint still gleaming under the harsh sun. Each car was eerily empty, their interiors undisturbed, as if their occupants had vanished into thin air. Fear, primal and instinctive, began to creep into their hearts. The silence of the highway was no longer just unnerving, it was oppressive, heavy with an unseen menace. They quickened their pace, their eyes darting nervously at the abandoned vehicles, their minds conjuring up terrifying scenarios. As dusk approached, casting long eerie shadows across the highway, they stumbled upon a small town. Relief washed over them, a beacon of civilization in this desolate wasteland. But as they approached, their relief turned to horror. The town was deserted, buildings stood empty, their windows dark and lifeless. The streets were eerily silent, not a single soul in sight. It was as if the entire town had simply vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence that spoke volumes. They pressed on, desperation fueling their steps, their senses on high alert and their hearts pounding in their chests. The town was like a ghost town, frozen in time, its silence amplifying their growing fear. As darkness fell, they came to a crossroads. In the fading light, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. Relief flooded them, a glimmer of hope in this desolate landscape. They called out, but the figure remained motionless, its back to them. As they drew closer, their hearts sank. The figure was a scarecrow, its straw-stuffed body dressed in tattered clothing, its painted face twisted into a grotesque grin. It was a cruel joke, a symbol of their isolation and despair. They collapsed on the roadside, their bodies spent, their spirits broken. They were trapped in a nightmare, a desolate highway populated by abandoned cars and ghost towns. Their hope, once a flickering flame, now threatened to be extinguished by overwhelming despair. Looks like there's a storm approaching. I glanced out the window of the car and looked behind us as my fiancée, Kiva, came out of the shop with a bag of snacks for our trip. The sky looked gray just a few feet behind us down the road. I heard low rumbling as Kiva opened the driver's side door and got in. "Do you think the roads will get bad?" I asked her. She glanced behind us for a few seconds before turning on the engine. The 80s station we had been listening to on our road trip turned on, and the music filled the car as Kiva pulled out of the gas station parking lot. "We can always pull over if they do," she replied. "Don't you think we should fill up on gas soon?" I asked. "I think we should be fine for now." I glanced over at the dashboard. "There's a quarter of a tank left," I noted. "Babe, it's fine. Trust me. You worry too much. Besides, that's more than a quarter." I sighed as I tried not to let it bug me. I hated getting lower than half a tank in my own car, it stressed me out to no end. We pulled out onto the road, and I grabbed my phone. As I opened the weather app, I looked at the forecast for the day, sunny with a high of 95. That couldn't be right. I made sure that I had cell service before opening the app again, thinking that maybe it would refresh. It didn't, and the forecast still said the same. "Huh," I said. "That's weird." "What's weird?" Kiva asked. I looked in the side mirror at the darkening skies behind me. The clouds were catching up to us quickly. "Melanie," I glanced back at Kiva. "The weather app says it's supposed to be sunny today. Maybe the app is down." "Yeah, maybe," I replied. We continued down the road and stopped at a red light. I shifted in my seat so I could look behind us at the approaching storm. I could see the dark clouds moving across the sky, heading directly towards us. I turned back to face the road ahead of us when suddenly the sound of thunder boomed across the sky. I jumped as it was followed by a flash of lightning. All of a sudden, a scream erupted behind us. "What was that?" Kiva asked. "Oh my God, what the?" someone yelled. The people in the cars around us began to roll down their windows to get a better view of whatever was happening. Kiva shifted the car into park and undid her seatbelt as she opened the door and stepped out of the car. I followed, walking between the traffic. As I followed Kiva, there was a crowd forming a few feet away where an old woman was crying and shouting nonsense. I looked up at the sky again and noticed that the gray clouds were even closer now, and I couldn't see anything in the distance anymore. I glanced back towards the car and then up at the traffic light, which was now green. No one was driving off yet, though, as everyone had gotten out of their cars to investigate. Suddenly, the loud sound of crushing metal caught my attention. As I looked towards the sound, a white pickup truck had been almost completely crushed. I squinted to get a closer look and noticed that there seemed to have been a person inside the truck when it was flattened, and their blood and insides covered the windshield. I looked away quickly as I took deep breaths, trying not to gag. Other people had started to walk toward the crushed truck, and some were gagging and backing up as they realized what they were seeing. "What did?" someone screamed again. The sound of crushing metal was heard, and the second car had been crushed. This time, it had only been the hood of the car that had been crushed, and the driver ran out to look at the damage. "Get back in your cars now," someone screamed. I locked eyes with Kiva, and we ran to the car, getting in and slamming the doors shut. As Kiva shifted back into drive and managed to pull in between the cars and speed through the intersection, I kept looking behind us as the clouds continued to approach. I could see raindrops now. Some of the people had made it away just in time, and others got caught in the rain. The sound of multiple cars being crushed filled the street as Kiva sped down the road. Luckily for us, it was mainly empty. I held on to the armrest as Kiva kept speeding. "Is that the rain doing that?" I asked, glancing back again. "I think so," Kiva muttered. She continued to drive, hyper-focused on the road. I glanced over at the speedometer. She was going almost 90. I looked over at the side of the road as we passed a speed limit sign but said nothing. I looked back at the approaching storm. The rain had picked up excessively, and all of the trees and stop lights had been crushed. They were now crumpled up in the middle of the road, blocking anyone else from escaping the storm. As I glanced down in the rearview mirror, I noticed that most of the road was gone too. There were giant holes everywhere, making it impossible to drive on. My body flung forward as Kiva hit the brakes. All of a sudden, the sound of the screeching brakes and the tires on the road filled my ears as she tried to stop the car. She exclaimed, and the car finally came to a stop. I looked over at her. "Why are you stopping?" She motioned towards the road where there was a giant tree branch blocking the way. "Help me move it, hurry." I jumped out of the car and helped her push the branch out of the way. As we pushed, I couldn't help but glance toward the storm, which was still rapidly approaching. The rain was also picking up, and it seemed like we were right, the rain was to blame. I used all my strength to push on the branch as Kiva pulled, and we finally got it out of the way. We ran back to the car and I glanced back to see the rain approaching. As the first drop of rain landed on the roof of a small convenience store on the side of the road, it all crumbled to the ground. I slid into the seat of the car. "What do you think happens if it lands on someone?" I asked. Kiva turned to look at me. She opened her mouth to speak but didn't get to, as she glanced out one of the back windows. I followed her gaze and saw a man walking down the side of the road. In a split second, the rain caught up. 1 second he was there, and the next second, there was a splatter of blood and human insides on the sidewalk. "I guess that's your answer," Kiva said as she started driving again. I turned around in my seat to keep an eye on the storm. It seemed that the winds had started to pick up, and I could hear them whistling as Kiva continued to drive. "It's getting faster," I replied. She said nothing, but I could feel the speed of the car picking up. We'd been on the road for about half an hour now, and the storm seemed to consistently pick up speed with each second that passed. I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the approaching storm and all of the damage that the rain had done. We'd seen it crush a few more people as it passed through. I don't know how long this storm is going to last or how far out it's going to travel, I thought. But I'm hoping that I can at least warn a few people. Maybe you can make a plan to outrun it. We're going to run out of gas soon, and there's no way that we would have enough time to stop and fill up on gas without the storm catching up to us and crushing our car, and then us. I don't know what we're going to do. We haven't even passed another car that we could potentially steal to try to outrun the storm. I don't know if anyone will even see this or how this will even help, but if you start to see the storm approaching, start running. Immersed between the pines, that was the predicament I currently ended up in, an empty highway spanning miles and miles through one of the most desolate roads in the Rocky Mountains. How long had it been since I was at Jim's diner, looking at the sky gray and foreboding, obvious that a storm was on the horizon. There was that smell in the air, sulfur, between the heat of the afternoon and the sudden chill. I could even feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. Trapped on this highway, with no exit for 40 miles, no car or truck for at least 2 hours, and my bike broken down. Wonderful, I muttered, exasperated. Could today get any worse? I had run out of gas. There were some farmlands a few miles back, lost to the oncoming darkness and surrounding sea of pines. The odd feeling, beyond the sense of being completely alone, was that of truly being alone. No chirp or buzz, even howling, that would animate these mountains, beyond the roar of tires and horns, like life itself had found residence elsewhere, leaving me in this impersonation of the world I once was in. Climbing up the hill, feeling the first drops of rain hitting my leather jacket, I felt the first tinge of fear. Until the end of the hill, I saw an exit, plain as day. The name of the town was Padua, the other name was scribbled out. Padua, I thought. Beggars can't be choosers. The walk didn't take as long as I expected it would. The cut into the pines led to a town trapped in another time. Not a ghost town from the last century with broken-down ranches and general stores, but a town that looked like a postcard from the 50s. That retro look was long associated with the big bop monster movies and drive-in theaters. There was only one problem with the site: not a single soul, nor a single car, was moving throughout the town. Instead, there was only the same silence I had heard throughout the mountain highway. There wasn't much more to think about. I resolved to explore the town as it started to come more into view with each step and push. There was a gas station not too far away, a diner down the block, and, from the looks of it, a hotel in the center between the two. I should name this town Lucky Break. "Hello," I called out, standing at the gas station, my bike parked at a stall. No dust, the pumps were on but locked. Walking into the store, which was open, the lights flickered almost as a response. Anyone here? The store was completely packed full of food and drinks, just no worker. Maybe he's on break, I muttered to myself, trying not to dissect the logic any further. I grabbed a protein bar and a bottle of water. It was still cold and fresh to the touch. There was a feeling that I was being watched. Maybe it was just the eerie feeling of being alone. As the doors shut behind me, I could have sworn I saw a shadow sitting at the register. When I did a double take, I found the store completely empty. Drinking the water and chewing on the bar, it had been hours since I had eaten or drunk anything. I released the trigger to let the gas pump start. There wasn't any other way I knew how to get it to work, no credit card slot, no manual pump on the outside. Must be an older job. When I finished filling up the bike, I took in the scenery and watched the clouds. The bike came to life, and I looked around, still feeling that sense of not being alone. Oh well, I spoke aloud as I entered the empty street. I decided that, while it was only slightly drizzling, I might as well explore the town. Spanning only a few blocks, lights were on in most buildings. However, there wasn't a sign of a single human, animal, or even insect. Like a model or a set of a movie left alone, tomorrow they'd come back and start again. There were a few buildings I tried. I needed a bathroom anyway. A few cloth shops, nothing that I needed or wanted. Being on a bike limits what can be carried. Then there was a library, stacked with books. There was a theme I noticed, not thanks to the books, but the periodicals. Nothing past the date of 1958. That didn't make sense. The last article read about the local football team going off to take the championship on October 21st. What happened October 22nd? There was too much to think about. The only thing that mattered was finding shelter and maybe getting a proper dinner. In all this commotion, I realized leaving the library that I still hadn't charged my phone. What was I thinking? Finding the diner I had passed before, the setup was one of those tube-like buildings that used to populate the country, slowly disappearing one by one to make way for franchises. Hello, I left my bike in the parking lot. The rain started to pick up, nothing hard yet, but it was coming soon. Again, I began to wonder why I would even ask. At this point, I'm just going to let myself in. I found a place for my phone to charge. The outlet looked a little weird, but it fit. When the screen came on, I could have guessed as much, no signal. Looking around the empty diner with its colorful booths, counter cakes in the displays, the grill in the back, even a jukebox and cigarette dispenser, I walked up, placing a few loose quarters in both. I found myself putting "Jingle, Jingle, Jingle" on the jukebox, a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. I checked the back room, the grills all worked and even the ovens. Playing with the switches, I found myself even dancing to antiquated songs, singing with a sparse knowledge of the lyrics. There was a fridge full of vegetables, red meat, even a steak. Putting the steak on, I heard "The End of the World" by Skeeter Davis starting to play. The eerie song almost put the sound of complete silence in perspective. During the summer last year, I chose not to take any classes and got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of disillusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy, and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow until about 5 o'clock in the morning. This gave me plenty of time to clean, stock the shelves, and chill out until the morning rush. Occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was of course until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight, then they went home, and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he bought was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2:01. My county has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, as politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country and that it was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job. But this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pawn for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 o'clock when he walked in. He kind of made a good point, so I eventually caved just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then, of course, he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it as there was no rule against tobacco sales. He smiled at me and then left the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. I thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead, he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed. He cracked open a can of beer and started drinking it. Now I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that, especially that close to a car. But I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, smirking as if they knew what I was thinking and were challenging me to try. Before I could find the courage, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and two more guys got out and joined the others. They were all part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night yet. That was the most reasonable explanation, but my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. Then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it at that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said he really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, so I let him do what he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I was dreading having to count change in front of him. But then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside, and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer. Apparently, they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. I then realized they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these pricks, and I knew I would either get in trouble over it or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody, not a single person except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back to the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told them to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register if those guys ever decided to come back. Still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. I don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. Years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop that doubles as a popular venue for local artists and musicians to host all sorts of small-time gigs. Even today, it gets most of its business in the evenings during the open mics and stays open until 1 a.m. However, when I worked there pre-2020, they were open 24/7 from Thursday to Sunday. For the most part, everyone that worked there hated the graveyard shift. It was easy hours, but the tips were abysmal as barely anyone came in. As far as I was concerned, however, I didn't mind the lower pay. What I hated was being alone and running the only place that was still open for miles. The shop was in a good part of town, if not a little close to a bad part, but the fact of the matter is that there's really no such thing as a good side of town during these overnight hours, if we're being completely honest. I was advised to never keep more than $50 in the drawer during the graveyard shift for a reason. I was always afraid that somebody would drag me into the back of the store, so every time I was scheduled for the overnight shift, I asked one of my male friends to come hang out with me. The one guy who would help me more than anyone else was named Bob. It usually turned out to be a good time. I made some money, I slipped him some beers under the table, and of course, I felt much more comfortable not being a woman on her own. Bob would work on his laptop while I was busy, and we would talk when things were slow. We had been friends for a while, but we became close after spending a lot of time together. It was always platonic, though. Bob was also friends with many of my coworkers, and lots of us joked that Bob knew so much about the coffee shop that he might as well work there himself. But he always laughed it off and said his career in photography was more important, which we always gave him a hard time for. I didn't really think there would ever be any bad blood between us, and if there was, I was sure it would be because we slipped up and had an awkward one-night stand. But then came a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019. I was working the last overnight shift of the weekend. I had worked the last 2 nights in a row without Bob because he had bailed on me to go to a wedding for one of his family members. I managed to get another friend of mine to fill in for him for Thursday and Friday, but on Saturday night, they were too tired and never showed up. I was anxious about being alone in the shop, but I knew I could manage. Thankfully, it was surprisingly slow that night for some reason, and by 3 a.m., I had only made $10 in tips. But I was glad I didn't have to deal with any crazy people. Unfortunately, that's when things took a dark turn. The shop was completely empty except for me. I was putting a batch of coffee into the roaster when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walk past the front window. I glanced over, but there was nobody there. I waited for someone to come around to the back door, which customers could also use, but a full minute had passed now, and nobody came. I stuck around by the register for a few more minutes, but after nobody showed up for a while, I decided it was time to mop the floors. I went into the back to fill up the mop bucket, and of course, as soon as I turned the faucet on, I heard somebody come in through the front door. I shouted that I would be with him in just a minute, then finished filling up the bucket and rolled it out behind the counter. When I got there, whoever came in had disappeared. I shrugged it off, just figuring they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then I started mopping behind the counter. The stranger's feeling hovered over me. I couldn't place what it was, but I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into. Even then, that would have been loud enough for me to hear over the running water. I leaned over the bar and checked the bathroom doors. The men's room door was closed, and the light was on, so I knew somebody was in there. My stomach churned slightly as I knew it was a man in there, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong, so I just kept on mopping. When I finally got finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened, and to my surprise, Bob walked out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing there. He explained that he had just gotten home from the wedding and thought he'd stop by and say hi. I was grateful that he decided to show up, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted on the house. I got behind the espresso machine and got to work pulling a shot. I packed the grounds into the portafilter and locked it into the machine, then looked over to say something to Bob. But whatever I was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment of time, and suddenly a wave of chills went through my body. "What are you doing?" I asked, fighting back trembling. Bob grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife out from behind his back. "I'm finally going to bang the barista," he said as he started to laugh. "Don't be crazy," I shouted. "We're friends." "What about the cameras?" Bob began walking forward, forcing me to backpedal. "We are friends," he said, "and nobody will believe you because the cameras aren't even on. They never are." "How do you not know that?" I knew at this point I was being pushed into the back of the shop, and my throat started to close up. It was also in that moment, when I looked for an exit, that I realized he had locked both the doors and turned the open sign off, keeping anybody from coming in. "Your boss already thinks we do this every night," Bob pressed on, inching closer and closer. "Stop it." I shouted in desperation, looking for something to defend myself and trying not to slip on the wet floor. "Shut up," you screamed. "You should have been giving this to me for months already. Do you not know how much time I wasted on you?" I was pleading and about to be cornered. The last hope I had was something on the sandwich counter. In the last moment before he pushed me out of sight into the back of the shop, I grabbed for the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and sliced open my arm, but I connected the hit. Combined with the water on the floor, the blow knocked him off of his feet. I wasted no time climbing over the counter and rushing out of the back door. I slipped into my car while I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about driving off that I realized Bob had parked his car in front of mine to deliberately keep me from getting away. Moments later, while I was on the phone with the operator, he came outside and attempted to break his way into my car. After he failed to do so for several minutes, he gave up and drove off, not long before the police arrived. I was treated for my wound and gave my statement about what happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. I was too much in a state of shock to even be in disbelief. As it turns out, he was right about the cameras inside the shop just being for show. However, nobody thought I was lying about what he did. Unfortunately, though, due to civil liabilities on the part of my employer and, more importantly, the fact that Bob completely up and disappeared after posting bail, I decided to drop the charges. I came to the conclusion not long after that he had already ruined his life sufficiently, and I simply didn't care enough to do anything else about it. Nobody has seen or heard from Bob in years, and the coffee shop has since stopped staying open overnight. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancé, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. I was home alone one night for a reason I don't remember. All I remember is my entire family was gone. I was 13 or 14 years old. I was a big gamer at the time. I was obsessed with StarCraft, and admittedly sometimes spend a weekend night or two playing StarCraft or some other PC game. This was right before co-lockdown started. I was playing StarCraft on my computer in my bedroom on the first floor. That's when the doorbell rang twice. I hurried to the door, not wanting to be away from the game for too long, in fear of losing. I got to the front door and said, "Who is it?" as I always would if I was alone. A soft and weak voice on the other side said something that I couldn't hear. It sounded like a woman. I opened the door with the storm door still separating me and this older woman standing on the other side with a big smile on her face. She had her hands behind her back. I said through the door, "Can I help you?" She said she needed to use a phone and asked if she could come inside. Ever since I was a little kid, I was always taught not to let a stranger into the house, ever. That included women. I felt so awkward, though. I didn't know how to turn her away. I redirected her to the library a few blocks down because they'd surely have a phone. Deep down, I knew the library was closed at this point, but I was just trying to get this stranger who was trying to get into my house to leave. She was still smiling, but what she said next did not match her smile. She said, "That's very rude to turn away an old lady asking for help." I replied the only way I could think to, and that was that my parents don't allow strangers into the house. It's a house rule. I slowly started closing the door as I was saying sorry, and she just stood there, not moving, but still smiling at me. And though her smile never changed, it suddenly felt much more menacing. I was walking back to my room when the doorbell rang again. There was no way in hell I was opening the door again. That woman radiated weird vibes from the start. Maybe something was wrong with her. Maybe she wasn't all there. These were things I had no way of knowing, and maybe that was selfish of me to send her on her way, but I just wasn't opening the door for anyone when I was home alone. I went back to my game, not too long after I sat back down. I heard something tapping on the window. It was a clinking type sound from something metal. The window was directly in front of my desk. I had the blind pulled down, so I couldn't see what was making the noise, but I already had an idea. My room was the only room with a light on in the house. The horrible thought that it was the old woman from just before, and that she walked over to my window, terrified me. I turned off the sound on my computer at this point. I didn't care about my game anymore. The clanking sound on the window persisted. I basically said, "F this," and up and left to a different room in the house. I sat in the darkness of the living room for a bit. When the doorbell rang again, this woman was harassing me now. I tried to convince myself she wasn't a threat, just some crazy old woman who's probably clueless as to where she is. When she rang the doorbell a second and third time, I decided to go open the door and ask her if there's someone I could call for her, but when I opened the door there was now a man on the other side. He looked to be about 10 years younger than her. He said through the storm door, "Have you seen my mother?" I replied saying yes, she came to my door just before. He then apologized to me and said she has dementia and got out of the house. I suddenly felt bad, but he asked me if he could come in for a minute. And again I felt awkward. Why did he need to come inside? I said the same thing that I told to the woman who he claimed to be his mother. I said we could just talk through this door. I then said that I think she went into my backyard because I heard something at my window. I told him he could go around back and check. He thanked me and walked down the walkway, and I thought he went into the backyard, but when I went to the back and looked out the back window expecting to see him searching around, I saw nobody, not him or his mom. This was all too weird for me. I went to bed on the earlier side that night, just falling asleep with the TV on in the background until I heard the clear blinking sound on the window again. Something metal was tapping on the glass. I remembered the concerned man and I decided to try and help. I went to the window, lifted the blind up with my hand, and I saw that woman outside my window with that same creepy smile. She was tapping a kitchen knife on my window. I closed the blind and crawled back into my bed. This didn't feel like it was actually happening. A suspiciously short amount of time later, the doorbell rang like 4 times. The clinking onto the window stopped by this point. This was all too suspicious. It felt like some kind of robbery attempt. I ignored the doorbell. I stayed in my bed. I was going to wait this out. I didn't have a cell phone at this time. I wasn't the most social guy growing up. I also didn't want to call the police for some reason. I waited this all out until it finally stopped. The next morning I told my dad what happened. When I called him, he told me I was smart not to open the door. Everyone agreed that everything about it sounded like an attempted robbery. Is there a chance that maybe that woman really did have dementia and that the man was really her concerned son? Maybe. But it all seemed too coordinated. Why did he want to come into the house too? How did he even know she came to my house specifically? Why didn't he ever go into the backyard to look for her when I gave him permission to do so? Too many unanswered questions that lead me to believe I avoided something terrible happening if I opened that door. My wife and I take yearly vacations to different places. It's our way of taking a break from regular everyday life as well as getting to spend some quality time together. This year, we had a cabin booked in Washington State. It was far out and described online as being quiet and peaceful, away from any other places or people. Most of our life is in crowded cities, so this sounded great for us. When we flew in, we walked to a grocery store to pick up what we needed, then took a taxi out to the cabin. We didn't rent a car because we knew we'd only be there for 3 days, so we wanted to spend it just at the cabin. If we changed our minds or needed anything else, we could always just order an Uber. The taxi ride was just over an hour from the town we landed in. Most of the drive was between huge mountain ranges and tree-covered landscape. It was really beautiful and got us both excited for our stay. Then at just about 7 p.m., we arrived at the cabin. It was completely alone in the middle of the forest. Even the driveway leading to it wasn't much more than some tire tracks in the dirt. We got out, paid the taxi, then brought our stuff inside. The cabin itself was small. There was the main floor that had the kitchen and living room, with a ladder leading up to a loft area that had the bed in it. The bed area on the loft was short, though. You literally had to crawl into the bed, kind of like one you'd see in a tiny home. Anyway, we unpacked the groceries and made a very quick dinner since we were tired from the flight. Then we opened a bottle of wine to settle in for the night. We lit up the fireplace and chatted about how we were looking forward to the next few days. It was around 11 p.m. at this point, and as we talked, we both suddenly heard something outside. Someone was walking in the grass near the cabin. It was loud too, like they were really close. My wife looked nervous, so I tried to put a brave face on and told her it was fine. I got up and looked out the window. It wasn't until then that I realized how dark it had gotten outside. I looked around, seeing nothing but large trees everywhere and pitch-black darkness around them. I told her I didn't see anyone, then went over to the front door and opened it, stepping onto the porch and turning on the outdoor lights. All I could really see out there was a small portion of the driveway, but I didn't see anyone there either. The forest was very calm and quiet too, so if they were still walking around, I felt like I would have been able to hear them. I went back inside and asked my wife if she heard the footsteps anymore, but she said the sound didn't seem to fade out. It just stopped suddenly from somewhere behind the cabin. My brave act was starting to fall through, and I told her to go up to the loft and stay quiet while I figured out what was going on. I went around and checked all the windows again, not seeing anything. So, I went back to the front door. I was preparing myself to go back outside when a sudden thump shook the cabin. I looked up at my wife, who was looking up at the ceiling. Someone was on the roof of the cabin. I stayed inside and called the police, going over lengthy directions on how to get to the cabin we were at. Over the course of the hour that we had to wait, we could occasionally hear a few footsteps walking across the top of the cabin. About 45 minutes into the wait, though, we heard their boots hit the ground, followed by them calmly walking away. I looked out the window once more, seeing their outline disappearing into the forest. Police took our report and gave us a ride into town, where we spent the rest of our vacation. What that person was doing miles away from civilization in the middle of a forest is terrifying, seeing as they were likely waiting for us to either go to bed or go outside. We're just thankful that we got out of there before something else could have happened. I regrettably used to work at a hotel in our town. Our town had gotten hit by a hurricane a few months back, and a lot of houses were badly damaged, so many people vacated the place. The hotel is about a 15-minute walk from my house. The town and hotel name I'll leave out of this, as I really just don't want anything traced back to me. The hotel was a very standard bed and breakfast type place, you know, where they serve wet scrambled eggs, frozen sausages, and assorted cereals. The hotel had a busy month after the hurricane, as some people were out of their houses due to damages. But after a while, things quieted down, if anything, quieter than before the hurricane. I always worked nights from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. Then someone would relieve me at 2 a.m., and they'd work till 10 o'clock or 11 a.m. I could always see how many people were checked into the hotel, and at the time, it was only maybe 9 rooms, which wasn't a lot at all. I could go the whole night sometimes without seeing anyone. There was a back break room for employees with a coffee machine, fridge, table, and a couple of sofa-type chairs. The employee bathroom was also back there. At night, I spent most of my time back there. There was a bell at the front desk that people would ring if they needed anything. I was in the back when I heard a deep voice from the lobby saying, "Hello," repeatedly. I got up and went through the door leading to behind the counter and saw a man on the other side of the glass. There was a glass barrier with an opening underneath about 10 inches high. He said he needed towels. I grabbed him a couple of extra towels and slid them under the glass for him. He grabbed them rather aggressively, shot me this weird look, then walked to the room's hallway. I stayed in the lobby, now sitting in the rolling chair by the monitors, and I just watched that man on the camera walk down the hallway. He was looking around weirdly, then he started rubbing the towels on his face. I said out loud, "What in the world?" Then he got in the elevator, so I went back to the break room. It was maybe 10 minutes later when I heard a voice again from the lobby. It was the same voice. I walked back out, and that man was standing on the other side again. He said very loudly, "My key card is broken." I asked what his room number was. He said it was something random, like 2C something with a letter in it. Our hotel rooms strictly had numbers, no letters, so I knew this man was lying. I told him, "Sir, our rooms don't have letters. Are you sure you're staying here?" His reaction was not something I was expecting, nor was it something I wish I ever had to be a victim to. He threw the towels on the floor, started smiling, and slightly tilting his head as he got closer to the glass. When his face was practically pressed up on the glass, he said, "I'm going to kill you," still with a smile on his face. Then he said it again, louder, and again. Each time he said it, it got louder until it was almost a scream. I screamed back at him, "I'm calling the police," and I did. I picked up the phone and showed him as I dialed 911. He kept his disturbing smile as he now started mocking me, calling the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher on the phone, explaining very loudly what was happening in front of my face, the sick man laughed and headed for the door in a slow walk. I told the dispatcher he was leaving, and when he was gone through the doors and out of sight, I said he was gone. She asked me if I still wanted an officer to show up, and I said no, it's all right. So the next couple of hours of my shift went slow. I decided for obvious reasons to hang around in the lobby now instead of the break room. There was one guest who checked in during this time. At around 2 a.m., my relief came, and I clocked out and was free to go home. I walked outside to the parking lot. It was cold out. I remember wishing I had brought my coat. I walked with my hands in the pockets of my light jacket and my hood up. Then I heard a voice in the parking lot. I turned around. There was a line of bushes that covered the first-floor windows of the hotel. It came from the bushes. I don't know what the voice said. I didn't care. I walked faster now. Once I got out of the parking lot, I was on a main road for a brief minute, but there were no cars on the road in this quiet town at this hour. After a minute, I turned left down a residential street that would eventually turn onto my block. It was dead silent out, not even the sound of any distant traffic, just the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement. And then the sound of someone else's shoes hitting the pavement behind me, only it was the sound of someone running as if on their tiptoes, trying to be quiet. By the time I turned around, they stopped. There was a car right behind me, and I almost knew that there was someone hiding behind it. I heard laughing and then a familiar voice saying quietly, "I'm going to kill you." Without even seeing him, I knew it was that man. I looked around, planning out my next move. I couldn't outrun a man, let alone wearing my work shoes. I looked at the nearest house. It had an upstairs light on. Someone was awake. I would go run and ring the doorbell for help. I looked back at the car, and I saw him, that man, peeking his eyes out from behind the car as he inched around it to the front. When he got to the hood, the rest of his face and upper body were exposed, and I could see his disgusting, crazy smile again. I ran for the house, screaming, "Help me." I made it to the front door and rang the bell at least 3 times. That's when the man grabbed me and started choking me, whispering in my ear, "Die." In that moment, I thought my life was flashing before my eyes. Then an angel in the form of a man opened the front door to the house and screamed, "Hey," at the man choking me. The man's grip was released from my neck, and I fell to the floor. I never turned to watch the man run away, but the man from the house helped me up and brought me inside. He gave me water and called the police for me, and I explained the whole story to the police. They collected the CCTV footage of the man from the hotel and put feelers out to track him. I was called into the police station when they did a lineup of people who looked similar to the man on the CCTV footage, and I was asked to point out which man I thought was him. I looked at all 5 of them for like 5 minutes, and I ultimately said it wasn't any of them. I don't know if the pressure and nerves got to me, but in the moment, I truly didn't recognize him to be in that lineup. I hope to this day I didn't make a mistake and let that man roam free. So this happened a little over 2 years ago now. It was 2017, and I had just started a new job at a motel. It was low pay, but I needed an office job. One of my friends, John, got me this job. For a few days, I did training with the owner in the mornings. For 2 nights, John trained me. Our job was the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, nothing exciting, just checking guests in and doing paperwork. My boss, or the owner, went away with his wife on vacation for a week, which contributed to the swift training I had to endure. So it was my first night alone on the night shift. There was a monitor with security cameras around the motel's property and large glass windows all around the office building with a glass door. There was no night window like most motels have. It was fairly early in the night, at about 1 a.m. I was just doing my normal check-in paperwork when a man walked in and asked if we had any rooms available. Usually, if someone sketchy came in, my boss had me lie and say no. But he seemed normal at the moment, so without hesitation, I said yes. I began creating the reservation on the computer when I noticed he started swatting the air and making spitting noises as if he was being surrounded by flies. I tried to ignore it. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't my business, so I tried to check him into the room as quickly as possible. I gave him his key, and he was on his way. At this point in time, I could be described as very timid. I had a lot going on in my personal life, so I hope you can all understand my reaction to what happens next. The man came back from his room and slammed his hand on the glass door, causing me to jump, absolutely frightened. I looked up to see him just staring at me. He cracked the door and put his head through and said, "I can't get into my room. Why won't you let me into my room?" And my only defense is trying to be helpful, so I replied, "Maybe there's something wrong with your key. Let me give you another one." The look he had in his eyes was inexplicable. I felt like I was in absolute danger. I handed him his new key, and he went back to his room. I tried texting John because he's the one who trained me, though it was the middle of the night and he was asleep. I needed some guidance. With no reply from John, I noticed the man trudging down the stairs to come back. I went into absolute panic mode. I ran into the back office, locked the door, and pulled out my pocket knife. It's important to keep protection when working at night. I heard the man in the office yelling, "Hello? Hello? Why won't you let me into my room? Do you not like me?" Being an absolute idiot and not standing my ground or just calling the police when I was feeling scared, I decided to take the situation on alone. I replied, "I'm just on the phone. I'll be right out." I then started calling John over and over for help. No answer. I decided to take a few breaths and then step out of the office. The man was not there. He was in the bathroom. I started hearing him talking to himself angrily, saying, "Kill her, kill her." My heart sank. Still being an idiot and not calling the police, he came out, and I said, "Your key was broken. I'm sorry. Let me escort you to your room." He agreed. Thankfully, I was wearing a long-sleeved sweater, so with my arms down, I was able to hide my knife in my hand while holding it. I began to walk outside, and he seemed insistent on walking behind me. We began making our way to the staircase and up towards his room. I was sweating from how nervous I was, continuously looking behind me to make sure he wasn't going to make a move. He stopped at a room, and I stopped at his room a few doors down. I smiled and said, "Oh, that's the wrong room. This is your room," as it was clearly said on the door. This whole time, he was going to someone else's room and trying to open the door. After letting him into his room, I quickly ran back to the office and locked the door. I found out there was a lone woman staying in the other room he was trying to get into. The next guest I checked in was a police officer from a few towns over. I felt bad for confiding in him about the guy, but he seemed willing to keep an eye and ear out. The next night, the man came back, but I had the doors locked and told him we were all booked up. I explained to my boss what happened when he got back from vacation. However, he didn't take it very seriously. I continued to work there on the night shift for the next year, where many other strange encounters happened, but this was one of the worst. My name is Maury. I'm from the USA. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were together drinking coffee on the second floor. All of a sudden, we heard a loud bang, so we thought a client had fallen. We decided that I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague walked down the stairs, I looked at the monitor, which was on the second floor, and I saw someone in the department on the ground floor. He was inside the closed apartment. You could walk in over there, but you needed a code to get out. People with dementia lived there. We watched for a while, and the guy was stuck, he couldn't get out. We decided to go inside a room on the second floor of one of our clients because you needed a special key to go inside. We thought that was safer. We explained to her what was going on. She was perfectly capable of understanding the situation, and of course, we called 112. I explained the situation, and they told me they would come right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town not too far away from us. He was just talking with the cops while I called 112 and said they were on their way. When I hung up, I looked outside and saw that guy climbing out the window. So I called back. They asked if something had changed. The police arrived, and we did a walk with them throughout the whole building. The guy broke the door in the kitchen. His stuff to break the door was there on the ground. The police couldn't really do much. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we heard that they were riding around the building 2 hours before the guy went in, and the guy had walked all over the ground floor, all while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day, I had one more night shift. Though I don't have that much to fear, it was still pretty scary. So I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs. We had 2 golden at the time, and they were actually okay with that. So I brought them with me the next night. Nothing happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course, I let them outside now and then to do their thing. The other night, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? They came back. They had robbed the safe. I always thought that the guy we had was just looking around to see if he could get away, but they had planned to come back for the safe the next night. But I'm guessing the 2 golden scared them off. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either if I didn't know them. Later on, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me because they felt safe with the dogs, and so did I. The funny thing was that the dogs knew the route we always walked. After a few times, I didn't even put their leash on, they just knew. If we needed to help a client, they just waited in the hallway until I was done. A few clients knew it because I told them, knowing that they loved dogs. So when they needed our help, the dogs went with us in their apartment. Both the dogs and clients loved that.